Hey there, friend. Welcome to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight's story isn't one of kings and conquests, but of whispered secrets and hidden lives. Whether you're settling in for the night or just looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you've joined me. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all wandering through history together, even from different corners of the globe. If this kind of gentle historical storytelling brings you peace, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely helps you drift off. We have many more stories to explore together in the soft hours of the night. Now, let's set the scene, shall we? Picture this. It's 2025. And you're scrolling through Instagram, perhaps lying in bed, much like you are now. You see posts from people celebrating their authentic selves, rainbow flags in bio after bio, couples of every combination sharing their joy without a second thought. You might swipe past a video about someone's gender journey, or see a friend post about their same-sex wedding. It's not revolutionary anymore. It's just normal. We live in an age where identity is fluid, where love is increasingly seen as love, where the alphabet soup of LGBTQIA+ grows longer each year as we find new ways to describe the beautiful complexity of human experience. Sure, there are still battles to fight, still hearts to change, still laws to pass. But compared to where we've been, compared to the shadows our ancestors walked through, we're living in what might as well be a rainbow-coloured utopia. But imagine, if you will, stepping back through time, not just decades, but centuries, back to an era where the very whisper of your true self could mean death, where love between two people of the same gender wasn't just forbidden, it was literally unthinkable to most, where the church held such power that even the suspicion of what they called unnatural acts could see you burned alive in the town square while your neighbours cheered. Tonight, we're going to explore that world, the medieval world, a place where being gay wasn't just difficult or dangerous, it was a death sentence waiting to be carried out, where the very concept of gender fluidity would have been so foreign, so terrifying to the medieval mind that it could only be explained as demonic possession or divine punishment. This isn't a story about progress, not exactly. It's about survival, about the incredible courage it took to love, to be authentic, to exist in a world that wanted you erased. It's about the people who lived and died in shadows, whose stories we're only now beginning to piece together from court records, church documents, and the occasional brave soul who dared to write something down. So settle in. Let the weight of the day fall away. We're about to journey into a time when love was measured not by the heart, but by the stake. When gender was not a spectrum, but a prison. When being different meant being dead. The medieval world was not kind to anyone who stepped outside the narrow lines drawn by God, king, and custom. But for those whose hearts beat differently, whose souls lived in bodies that didn't match what society expected, medieval Europe was quite literally hell on earth. Let's begin with what we know, or think we know. The medieval period, roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, wasn't one long, unbroken stretch of darkness. It evolved, changed, shifted. Early medieval Europe was actually somewhat more tolerant than what came later. The church hadn't yet developed its later obsession with sexual purity. Local customs still held sway in many places. But as the centuries rolled on, as the Catholic Church consolidated its power, as kingdoms became more organized and laws more codified, the space for difference grew smaller and smaller. By the high medieval period, roughly 1000 to 1300 CE, the noose was tightening. The church had developed sophisticated theories about natural law, about the proper order of things. And in that order, there was no room for love between men, no space for women who rejected their prescribed roles, no tolerance for anyone who might today identify as transgender or non-binary. The word sodomy comes from this era, named after the biblical city of Sodom. But medieval people used it much more broadly than we might expect. It didn't just mean sex between men. It could mean any sexual act that didn't lead to procreation. It could mean sex with animals, with demons, with the wrong person at the wrong time in the wrong way. It was a catch-all term for sexual deviance, and the punishment was always the same: death. But here's where it gets particularly cruel. The medieval mind didn't really have a concept of sexual orientation as we understand it today. They didn't think some people were just naturally attracted to the same gender. Instead, they believed that sodomy was a sin anyone could fall into, like gluttony or pride. It was a choice, a weakness, a giving in to temptation. This meant that the medieval gay person lived in a world that not only condemned their actions, but refused to acknowledge their very existence. There was no community to find, no identity to claim, no word for what they were. They were alone in a way that's almost impossible for us to imagine today. Consider the case of Arnold of Verneuil, a schoolmaster in the French village of Pamiers in the early 14th century. We know about Arnold because he was put on trial by the Inquisition in 1323, and the records survive. Arnold was accused of having sexual relationships with his male students. But what's fascinating about his case is how he defended himself. Arnold didn't deny the relationships. Instead, he argued that what he was doing wasn't really sodomy at all. He claimed he was the active partner, the one who penetrated, and therefore he wasn't committing the sin. In his mind, only the passive partner was truly guilty. It was a desperate defense, one that shows how people try to find loopholes in a system designed to destroy them. It didn't work. Arnold was sentenced to life in prison, though he may have escaped or been released later. But his case gives us a window into the medieval gay experience. Here was a man who had found a way to live, to love, to build relationships, even in a world that wanted him dead. He taught children. He was part of a community. He had lovers who cared for him, and yet he lived every day knowing that discovery meant destruction. The punishment for sodomy varied across medieval Europe, but it was always severe. In many places, the penalty was death by burning. This wasn't just execution, it was theatre. The condemned would be tied to a stake in the town square, often on market day when the crowds were largest. The fire would be lit, and the community would watch as the flames consumed someone they had once known as a neighbour, a friend, a fellow Christian. But burning wasn't the only option. In some places, the punishment was burial alive. The condemned would be thrown into a pit and covered with earth or stones. In others, it was hanging or beheading. The method varied, but the message was always the same. This is what happens to those who love wrongly. The legal codes of the time are chilling in their specificity. The Visigothic Code, which influenced law across much of medieval Europe, stated that men who had sex with other men should be castrated and then handed over to the bishop to be further punished. The Lombard laws called for death by sword. The laws of King Alfred in England prescribed burning. But perhaps even more terrifying than the formal legal punishments was the informal justice of the mob. Medieval people lived in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. Rumours spread quickly, suspicions grew. And when someone was accused of sodomy, the community often took justice into its own hands. There are records of suspected sodomites being dragged from their homes by angry crowds, beaten, tortured, and killed, without any legal process at all. The authorities often turned a blind eye to these lynchings, seeing them as righteous expressions of community outrage. This created a climate of constant fear. Medieval gay people learned to hide, to dissemble, to live double lives. They developed codes and signals, ways of recognizing each other without exposing themselves. They met in secret, loved in darkness, and always looked over their shoulders. Some found refuge in the church, ironically enough. The all-male environment of monasteries provided cover for relationships that might have been impossible in the outside world. But even there, the danger was real. Monks accused of sodomy could be defrocked, excommunicated, handed over to secular authorities for execution. The case of Peter Abelard, the famous 12th century philosopher, shows how precarious even the most privileged positions could be. Abelard had a passionate affair with his student Eloise, but there were also rumours about his relationships with male students. These rumours may have contributed to his downfall, to the brutal castration ordered by Heloise's uncle, to his eventual retreat into monastic life. Women faced their own unique challenges. Medieval society had very specific ideas about female sexuality, and women who stepped outside those boundaries faced consequences that were often worse than death. A woman who was too independent, too assertive, too interested in other women might be accused of witchcraft. The witch trials that would sweep Europe in later centuries had their roots in medieval attitudes toward non-conforming women. Women who lived together, who rejected marriage, who were seen as too masculine, were prime targets for accusations. The punishment for witchcraft was almost always death, usually by burning. But it's important to understand that medieval people didn't really have a concept of lesbianism as we understand it today. They believed that women were naturally passive, that they couldn't have real sex without a man. Two women together were seen as engaging in lesser sins, unless one of them was believed to be using some kind of artificial device to penetrate the other. Then it became sodomy, and the punishment was death. This gender blindness extended to what we might today call transgender people. Medieval society had rigid ideas about gender roles, and anyone who stepped outside them was seen as disturbing the natural order. Men who were too feminine, women who were too masculine, people who tried to live as the opposite gender, all face punishment. There are scattered records of people who tried to live as the opposite gender in medieval Europe. Some were discovered and punished. Others may have lived their entire lives successfully hiding their birth gender, but all of them lived with the knowledge that discovery meant death. The Church taught that God had created humans male and female, and that this division was sacred and immutable. To try to change your gender was to reject God's plan, to commit the sin of pride, to align yourself with the devil. It was heresy of the highest order. As we settle deeper into this dark chapter of history, as we let the weight of these stories sink in, it's worth remembering that these weren't just statistics or case studies. These were real people. They had names, faces, dreams, fears. They fell in love just like anyone else. They wanted to be happy, to be accepted, to live authentic lives, but they were born into a world that had no place for them. A world where love was regulated by law and scripture, where gender was a prison, where difference was death. They lived in shadows, loved in secret, and died forgotten. Tomorrow we'll explore how they survived, how they found each other, how they built communities, how they created meaning in a world that denied their very existence. We'll look at the codes they used, the places they gathered, the ways they resisted. But for now, let their courage wash over you. Let their stories remind you how far we've come, how precious our freedoms are, how much we owe to those who came before us. Close your eyes. Let the darkness of the medieval world fade away. You're safe here, in this time, in this place, where love is love, where identity is a gift, not a crime. The shadows are lifting. The dawn is coming, and in that dawn, finally, there is room for everyone. But survival in medieval times required more than just courage. It demanded cunning, secrecy, and an almost supernatural ability to read the hearts of others. Because in a world where a single accusation could mean death, gay people developed what we might call a sixth sense for danger. They learned to speak in codes, to communicate through glances, to find each other in the most unlikely places. A particular way of holding a cup, A specific phrase dropped into conversation, a lingering touch that could be explained away as accident. These became the languages of the hidden, the grammar of the forbidden. Consider the bathhouses of medieval Europe. These weren't just places to get clean. They were social centres, places where people from all walks of life came together in various states of undress. For gay men, they represented both opportunity and mortal danger. The close quarters, the nudity, the steam that could hide whispered conversations. All of this created possibilities for connection that simply didn't exist elsewhere. But bathhouses were also heavily watched. Church authorities knew what went on there, and they regularly sent spies to observe and report. The line between innocent bathing and sinful activity was thin, and it was constantly being patrolled. Men learned to be subtle, to communicate through the briefest of touches, to arrange meetings through coded conversations that sounded like discussions of trade or weather. The records from medieval Canterbury show that bathhouse owners were regularly fined for allowing immoral activities on their premises. But the fines were often light, suggesting that the authorities understood the social function these spaces served. It was a delicate balance, a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy that allowed society to function while maintaining the fiction of moral purity. For women, the challenges were different but no less dangerous. Medieval society expected women to be married, to be under the protection and control of a man. Two women living together would immediately raise suspicions unless they could find a way to explain their arrangement that satisfied social expectations. Some women found refuge in religious communities. Convents provided a legitimate reason for women to live together, to reject marriage, to form intense emotional bonds with other women. But even within these sacred walls, the danger was real. Abbesses kept careful watch for signs of particular friendships that might cross the line into sin. The letters of medieval nuns that survive today are fascinating documents. They speak of passionate love, of longing, of devotion that seems to transcend the merely spiritual. But they're written in the language of religious devotion, carefully coded to avoid suspicion. "I burn for you as the soul burns for God," one 12th century nun wrote to another. To the casual observer, it was pious enthusiasm. To those who knew how to read between the lines, it was a love letter. Other women found different strategies. Some entered into what were called Boston marriages, centuries before that term was invented. Two women would set up household together, often with one playing a more masculine role, handling business and finances, while the other maintained the domestic sphere. To their neighbours, they were simply spinsters, making the best of their unmarried state. In reality, they were couples, living as openly as they dared. But even these arrangements required careful navigation. The masculine partner had to be careful not to appear too masculine, lest she be accused of trying to usurp male authority. The feminine partner had to be careful not to appear too devoted, lest their relationship be seen as unnatural. They lived in a constant state of performance, always aware that their audience was watching for signs of deviation. The legal records from medieval France tell the story of Lawrence, a woman who lived openly as a man for over 20 years. She worked as a farmer, married a woman, and was accepted by her community as a man. But when a business dispute led to closer scrutiny of her background, her birth gender was discovered. The punishment was swift and terrible. She was stripped naked in the town square, flogged, and then burned alive while her wife was forced to watch. Lawrence's story is remarkable not just for its tragic ending, but for the fact that she managed to live authentically for 2 decades. How many others succeeded where she failed? How many people lived their entire lives successfully hiding their true selves? The nature of the secret means we'll never know. The medieval world was filled with what we might call gender performance. Everyone was expected to play their assigned role, to dress appropriately, to behave according to their station. But within these rigid boundaries, some people found ways to express their true selves. Male prostitutes existed in medieval cities, though they were always in danger. They developed elaborate networks of protection, often working under the patronage of wealthy men who could afford to pay for discretion. These networks extended across Europe, with traveling merchants and pilgrims carrying messages and arranging meetings between cities. The records from medieval Paris show that male prostitutes had their own districts, their own taverns, their own codes of conduct. They were tolerated as long as they remained invisible, as long as they didn't challenge the social order too directly. But periodically, when the authorities needed to demonstrate their moral authority, these networks would be raided, their members arrested, tortured, and executed. Female prostitutes who catered to women also existed, though they were even more hidden. Some worked in the guise of healers or wise women, offering services that went beyond the merely medical. Others operated within the networks of servants in wealthy households, where the close quarters and intimate nature of domestic service provided cover for other kinds of intimacy. The punishment for these activities was always death, but the methods varied. Some cities preferred burning, seeing it as a purification by fire. Others chose hanging, viewing it as a more efficient form of execution. Still others opted for drowning, believing that water would wash away the sin. The method mattered less than the message. This is what happens to those who love wrongly. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of medieval attitudes toward homosexuality was the way it was used as a political weapon. Accusations of sodomy became a convenient way to destroy enemies, to discredit rivals, to justify invasions and conquests. The Knights Templar, the powerful medieval military order, were destroyed in the early 14th century, partly through accusations of sodomy. King Philip IV of France, who owed the Templars enormous sums of money, orchestrated a campaign of accusations and trials that led to the order's dissolution. The charges were almost certainly false, but they were effective. The idea that these warrior monks were secretly engaging in unnatural acts was so shocking, so damaging to their reputation, that it made their destruction politically possible. Similar accusations were leveled against political enemies throughout medieval Europe. Kings accused rival nobles of sodomy to justify their imprisonment or execution. The church used such charges to eliminate troublesome priests or bishops. The accusation alone was often enough to destroy a person's reputation and career, even if they were never formally tried or convicted. This weaponization of sexual accusations created an additional layer of terror for gay people. Not only did they have to worry about being discovered in their actual relationships, they also had to fear false accusations from enemies who wanted to destroy them. In a world where guilt was often assumed rather than proven, where torture was used to extract confessions, where the accused had few rights or protections, even the innocent could be destroyed. The medieval mind struggled to understand homosexuality in ways that seem almost comical to us today. Medical texts of the period offered bizarre explanations for same-sex attraction. Some claimed it was caused by an excess of heat in the body, others by a deficiency of cold. Some blamed it on the position of the stars at birth, others on the diet of the parents during conception. One popular theory held that homosexuality was caused by demons who took possession of the body and corrupted its natural desires. This led to exorcism being used as a cure, with predictably horrific results. Gay people were subjected to ritual purification, to beatings designed to drive out evil spirits, to forced fasting and prayer that often led to death from starvation. Another theory suggested that homosexuality was a form of mental illness that could be cured through bloodletting, purging, or trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in the skull. Medieval medical practitioners claimed they could cure same-sex attraction by balancing the body's humours, by adjusting the patient's diet, by prescribing specific herbs or minerals. These treatments were not only ineffective, but often fatal. Yet they persisted because they offered hope to families who discovered that their loved ones were different. Rather than face the shame and danger of having a gay family member, some people chose to subject them to these torturous medical procedures. The Church, meanwhile, developed increasingly sophisticated theological arguments against homosexuality. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval philosopher, argued that same-sex relations were against natural law because they couldn't lead to procreation. This natural law argument became central to church doctrine and provided intellectual justification for the persecution of gay people. But Aquinas and other theologians also recognized that homosexual desires were real and persistent. They developed elaborate systems of penance and confession designed to help people resist these temptations. Gay people were encouraged to confess their thoughts and desires regularly, to perform acts of self-mortification, to devote themselves to prayer and good works. Some people found genuine solace in these religious practices. The idea that their desires were sinful but forgivable, that they could achieve salvation through struggle and penance, provided a framework for understanding their experience. But it also created immense psychological torment, forcing people to view their deepest emotions as evil and corrupt. The medieval period also saw the development of what we might call gay panic in legal proceedings. If someone was accused of sodomy, they could sometimes escape punishment by claiming they had been seduced or corrupted by their partner. The innocent party might receive a lighter sentence or even be freed entirely, while the seducer faced the full weight of the law. This created a legal incentive for betrayal. Partners would turn against each other, each claiming to be the victim of the other's corruption. Friends would denounce friends. Lovers would abandon lovers, all in the desperate hope of saving their own lives. The records from medieval courts are full of these tragic betrayals. Men who had loved each other for years suddenly claiming they had been forced into unnatural acts. Women who had shared their lives tearfully, testifying that they had been led astray by their companions. The system turned love into a liability, trust into a weapon. As the medieval period drew to a close, as the Renaissance began to dawn, attitudes towards sexuality didn't immediately improve. If anything, they became more rigid, more systematized, more deadly. The printing press allowed anti-gay propaganda to spread more widely. The Protestant Reformation created new forms of moral authority that were often even more intolerant than what had come before. But in the shadows, in the spaces between the laws and the sermons, people continued to love. They continued to find each other, to build relationships, to create meaning in a world that denied their existence. They developed traditions and customs that were passed down through generations of hidden people. They created art and literature that spoke in codes but carried profound truths. The medieval gay experience was one of extraordinary isolation and extraordinary connection. People who had never met shared common experiences, common fears, common strategies for survival. They created an invisible community that spanned centuries and continents, united by nothing more than the shared experience of being different in a world that demanded conformity. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember these hidden people. Remember their courage, their creativity, their refusal to be erased. They lived in darkness so that someday, somehow, others might live in light. They loved in secret so that love itself might survive. Their stories remind us that human connection is stronger than human hatred, that love finds a way even in the darkest times, that the human spirit cannot be broken by laws or flames or fear. They are the ancestors of everyone who has ever had to hide their true self, the spiritual parents of everyone who has ever had to choose between authenticity and safety. In a world that wanted them dead, they chose to live. In a world that wanted them silent, they found ways to speak. In a world that wanted them alone, they found each other. Their legacy is not just survival, but the preservation of hope itself. Close your eyes now. Let their courage carry you into dreams where love is not a crime, where identity is not a death sentence, where being different is not being dangerous. The medieval night is ending, and in its place, slowly, gently, the dawn of acceptance is beginning to break. But even in this darkness, there were moments of unexpected light. Medieval literature, when you knew how to read it, was filled with coded messages about love that dared not speak its name. The troubadours of southern France sang of passionate devotion between knights, ostensibly about courtly love for noble ladies, but with undertones that spoke to those who understood. The friendship between David and Jonathan in the Bible was invoked so frequently by medieval writers that it became a kind of shorthand for intense male bonds that transcended the merely platonic. These literary codes weren't just artistic flourishes, they were lifelines. A young man, struggling with feelings he couldn't name, might find comfort in a poem about David's lament for Jonathan. "I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women." Hidden in plain sight within sacred scripture was validation for emotions that the same scripture seemed to condemn. The medieval world was one of symbols and allegories, where nothing was ever quite what it seemed. A rose might represent the Virgin Mary, but it might also represent something else entirely to the right reader. A story about two knights sharing a tent might be about military camaraderie, or it might be about something deeper. The very ambiguity that made medieval literature so rich also made it a perfect vehicle for hidden meanings. Consider the matter of medieval marriage customs. We often think of medieval marriage as uniformly oppressive, but the reality was more complex. In many parts of Europe, marriages weren't legally binding until they were consummated. This created a grey area where intense same-sex friendships could flourish under the guise of unmarried companionship. Two men might share a bed, share their property, share their lives, and as long as they eventually married women, their earlier relationship would be overlooked or forgotten. Some scholars have argued that medieval society actually had more flexibility around gender and sexuality than we give it credit for. The rigid categories we associate with medieval thinking were often more aspirational than actual. People lived messy, complicated lives that didn't fit neatly into theological boxes, and medieval society found ways to accommodate this complexity, even if it couldn't openly acknowledge it. But this flexibility came with a price. The same ambiguity that protected some people also made everyone vulnerable. If the boundaries weren't clear, if the rules weren't fixed, then anyone could be accused of crossing them. The uncertainty was both a shield and a sword, protecting the clever while threatening the unlucky. The rise of universities in the medieval period created new opportunities for same-sex relationships. These institutions were exclusively male, filled with young men living in close quarters, studying together, sharing intellectual passions. The bonds formed in these academic communities were often intense and lifelong. Masters and students, fellow scholars, roommates in college dormitories, all of these relationships provided cover for deeper connections. But universities were also places of intense scrutiny. The Church kept a close eye on these institutions, worried about the corrupting influence of pagan learning and secular knowledge. Students and masters who were too openly affectionate, too devoted to each other, too dismissive of marriage and family, quickly found themselves under suspicion. The case of John of Salisbury, a 12th century scholar and bishop, illustrates these tensions. John wrote passionately about his friendships with other men, describing his love for them in terms that seem unmistakably romantic to modern readers. Yet he was also a high-ranking church official who preached against the very behaviours his letters seem to describe. Whether this represents hypocrisy, repression, or simply the complex reality of medieval emotional life, we'll never know. The medieval period also saw the development of what we might call romantic friendships between women. These relationships were often celebrated rather than condemned, perhaps because medieval society didn't believe women were capable of real sexual activity without men. Two women could live together, share their emotional lives, even share their beds, and it would be seen as natural feminine affection rather than sinful lust. The letters between medieval nuns are particularly revealing in this regard. These women wrote to each other with a passion and intimacy that would have been scandalous between men. They described their longing for each other, their physical desire to be together, their jealousy when their beloved formed relationships with others. But because these feelings were expressed in religious language, because they were framed as spiritual rather than carnal, they were not only tolerated, but encouraged. Some of these relationships were undoubtedly platonic, expressions of deep friendship rather than romantic love. But others clearly crossed the line into territory that the Church would have condemned if it had been recognized. The ambiguity of medieval attitudes toward female sexuality created space for relationships that would have been impossible for men. The medieval period also gave us some of the first recorded examples of what we might today call transgender people. These individuals faced unique challenges in a world that believed God had created humans male and female, and that this division was sacred and unchangeable. To try to live as the opposite gender was to reject God's plan, to commit the sin of pride, to align oneself with the devil. Yet people did try. The records are scattered and often incomplete, but they tell stories of remarkable courage. There was the 13th century woman who lived as a man for over 20 years, working as a soldier and even marrying a woman before being discovered and executed. There was the 14th century monk who was revealed after death to have been born female, leading to a scandal that rocked the entire monastic community. These individuals faced not just legal punishment, but social ostracism of the most complete kind. They were seen as having violated the most fundamental categories of human existence. Their very existence was considered an affront to the natural order, a sign of the world's corruption and decay. The medical understanding of gender in the medieval period was primitive by modern standards, but more flexible than we might expect. Medieval doctors believed that male and female bodies were essentially the same, with female genitalia being an inverted version of male organs. This one-sex model suggested that the boundary between male and female was less fixed than we might think, creating theoretical space for people who didn't fit neatly into either category. But this theoretical flexibility didn't translate into practical tolerance. People who tried to live as the opposite gender were still seen as rebels against divine order, criminals against nature, threats to the stability of society itself. The punishment was always death, usually by burning, as if fire could purify the corruption they represented. The medieval period also saw the development of complex legal codes around gender and sexuality. These laws varied from place to place, but they shared certain common features. They were detailed, specific, and brutal. They covered not just acts, but intentions, not just behaviors, but identities. They created a legal framework for persecution that would persist for centuries. But laws are only as effective as their enforcement, and enforcement in medieval Europe was often haphazard. Local authorities might turn a blind eye to behaviours they officially condemned, especially if the people involved were wealthy or well-connected. The same act that might lead to execution in one place might be overlooked in another, depending on politics, economics, and personal relationships. This inconsistency created a kind of geographic lottery for gay people. Some cities and regions were relatively tolerant, while others were notorious for their persecution. Information about these safe and dangerous places spread through informal networks, passed along by merchants, pilgrims, and travellers who carried more than just goods and prayers from place to place. The medieval period was also a time of great mobility for certain classes of people. Merchants travelled trade routes that spanned continents. Pilgrims journeyed to holy sites across Europe and beyond. Scholars moved between universities. Soldiers followed their lords to distant battlefields. For gay people, this mobility offered both opportunities and dangers. Travel meant escape from local scrutiny, the chance to reinvent oneself in a new place, the possibility of finding others like oneself in foreign cities. But it also meant leaving behind whatever protection and support one had managed to build at home. A merchant might find acceptance in one city, only to face persecution in the next. A pilgrim might discover a community of like-minded souls on the road, only to have that community scatter when the journey ended. The Crusades, those great military expeditions to the Holy Land, created particularly complex situations for gay people. On one hand, the all-male environment of crusading armies provided opportunities for relationships that might have been impossible at home. On the other hand, the religious fervour that motivated the Crusades often led to increased persecution of anyone seen as morally corrupt or spiritually compromised. The records from the Crusades include scattered references to soldiers being punished for unnatural acts with each other, but they also include accounts of passionate friendships between knights, of men who swore eternal devotion to each other, of relationships that seemed to have transcended the merely military. The line between acceptable male bonding and sinful sodomy was often unclear, and this ambiguity created space for relationships that might not have been possible in civilian life. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval gay life was its resilience. Despite the persecution, despite the isolation, despite the constant threat of discovery and death, people continued to find ways to love and be loved. They created networks of support and protection that spanned centuries. They developed traditions and customs that were passed down through generations of hidden people. They found each other in the most unlikely places and formed bonds that survived even the threat of execution. The medieval period gave us some of the first recorded examples of what we might today call gay activism. These weren't organised movements in the modern sense, but they were acts of resistance nonetheless. People who refused to hide, who challenged the laws and customs that oppressed them, who insisted on their right to love and be loved regardless of the consequences. These acts of resistance were often individual rather than collective, personal rather than political. A monk who refused to renounce his lover despite threats of excommunication. A woman who continued to live as a man despite repeated arrests. A scholar who wrote openly about his desires despite the risk to his career and life. But there were also moments of collective resistance. Communities that protected their gay members from outside persecution. Guilds that included gay people among their membership. Religious orders that turned a blind eye to relationships they officially condemned. These acts of collective defiance were rare and risky, but they happened and they mattered. The medieval period also saw the development of what we might call gay culture. This wasn't a unified, self-conscious movement, but it was a set of shared practices, symbols, and traditions that connected gay people across time and space. Certain poems, certain songs, certain ways of dressing or speaking, certain meeting places and customs, all of these became part of a hidden culture that existed alongside and within the dominant culture of medieval Europe. This culture was necessarily coded, necessarily hidden, necessarily fragmented, but it was real and it was resilient. It provided identity and community for people who were officially denied both. It created meaning and connection in a world that wanted to erase both. As the medieval period drew to a close, as the Renaissance began to dawn, the situation for gay people didn't immediately improve. If anything, the increased organisation of society, the growth of centralised authority, the development of more sophisticated legal and religious systems, all of these changes made persecution more systematic and more effective. But the Renaissance also brought new ideas about human nature, new forms of artistic expression, new ways of thinking about identity and desire. The humanism of the Renaissance created space for different kinds of human experience, even if it didn't immediately lead to greater tolerance. The printing press, that revolutionary technology of the late medieval period, had complex effects on gay life. On one hand, It allowed anti-gay propaganda to spread more widely and effectively than ever before. On the other hand, it also allowed coded messages of support and solidarity to reach larger audiences. The same technology that could destroy could also preserve and protect. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, as you let the weight of these stories settle around you like a blanket, remember that the medieval period was not just a time of darkness and persecution. It was also a time of remarkable courage and creativity, of people who refused to be erased, who found ways to love and be loved despite impossible odds. These medieval people, these hidden souls, these secret lovers, they are the ancestors of everyone who has ever had to hide their true self. They are the spiritual parents of everyone who has ever had to choose between authenticity and safety. They are the foundation upon which our modern freedoms are built. Their stories remind us that human connection is stronger than human hatred, that love finds a way even in the darkest times, that the human spirit cannot be broken by laws or flames or fear. They lived in shadows so that someday, somehow, we might live in light. The medieval night is long, but it is not eternal. Dawn is coming slowly, gently, inevitably. And in that dawn, there is room for everyone. But the medieval world wasn't just about individual persecution and private suffering. It was also about the systematic erasure of entire ways of being. The Church, in its growing power and influence, didn't just condemn homosexual acts. It worked methodically to eliminate any cultural memory that such love had ever been acceptable, natural, or even possible. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate campaign of historical revision that would make any modern propaganda minister proud. Church scholars went through classical texts, the works of ancient Greece and Rome, and carefully edited out or reinterpreted passages that spoke positively of same-sex love. They rewrote history to suggest that such relationships had always been condemned, that the persecution they were now implementing was simply a return to eternal moral law. The Sacred Band of Thebes, that legendary military unit of ancient Greece composed of 150 pairs of male lovers, was reframed as a brotherhood of arms with no romantic component. The passionate relationship between Achilles and Patroclus in Homer's Iliad was sanitized into mere friendship. Plato's dialogues about love between men were twisted into allegories about spiritual rather than physical connection. This systematic erasure meant that medieval gay people had no historical precedent to point to, no cultural tradition to claim as their own. They were told, and many believed, that their desires were unprecedented, unnatural, a new form of corruption that had never existed before. The isolation was complete, not just from their contemporaries, but from their own past. But perhaps most insidiously, the Church created what we might call a theology of self-hatred. Gay people were taught that their desires were not just sinful, but were actually a form of spiritual warfare. The devil, they were told, was using their bodies as battlegrounds, corrupting their natural impulses to turn them away from God. This meant that medieval gay people lived in a constant state of internal conflict. They were taught to view their deepest emotions as evidence of demonic possession, their capacity for love as proof of spiritual corruption. The psychological torment this created was immense. Many people internalized these messages so completely that they became their own worst persecutors. The confessional system, where Catholics were required to regularly confess their sins to a priest, became a particular torture for gay people. They were expected to confess not just their actions, but their thoughts, their desires, their dreams. The priest would assign penance, often involving self-flagellation, fasting, or other forms of self-punishment designed to drive out the evil impulses. But here's where it gets particularly cruel. The Church also taught that these desires would never fully go away. They were a permanent stain on the soul, a constant temptation that would have to be resisted until death. There was no cure, no redemption, no hope of ever being free from the burden of wrong desire. Some people found ways to reframe this hopelessness. They viewed their struggle as a form of martyrdom, a special calling that brought them closer to God through suffering. They saw their pain as redemptive, their isolation as spiritual purification. It was a way of finding meaning in misery, of transforming persecution into purpose. The medieval period also saw the development of what we might call gay geography. Certain cities, certain regions, certain types of communities became known as places where different kinds of people might find refuge. Venice, with its cosmopolitan merchant culture and relative independence from church authority, developed a reputation for tolerance. The universities of Paris and Oxford, with their all-male environments and emphasis on intellectual rather than physical relationships, provided cover for intense same-sex bonds. But this geography was constantly shifting. A city that was safe one year might become dangerous the next, depending on changes in leadership, economic conditions, or political pressures. The same flexibility that protected some people also made everyone vulnerable. Safety was always temporary, always conditional, always revocable. The medieval period was also a time of what we might call gender panic. As society became more organized, as roles became more clearly defined, as the church's teachings became more systematized, the pressure to conform to strict gender norms increased dramatically. Men were expected to be masculine in very specific ways. Women were expected to be feminine according to very narrow definitions. Anyone who deviated from these norms, even slightly, risked suspicion. A man who was too gentle, too interested in beauty, too devoted to other men, might find himself accused of effeminacy, which was often a precursor to accusations of sodomy. A woman who was too independent, too strong, too uninterested in marriage and children, might be labelled as unnatural, which could lead to charges of witchcraft. This gender panic created a climate of constant self-surveillance. People learned to monitor their own behaviour, to suppress any tendency that might be seen as inappropriate to their gender. Men learned to walk differently, to speak differently, to express emotion differently. Women learned to be more submissive, more quiet, more focused on domestic concerns. The pressure was so intense that it affected even people who weren't gay. Heterosexual men, who were naturally gentle or artistic, found themselves having to perform masculinity in exaggerated ways to avoid suspicion. Heterosexual women who were naturally independent or intellectual had to hide these qualities to avoid being labelled as unnatural. This performative aspect of medieval gender created a world where everyone was acting, where no one could be entirely authentic. The line between acceptable and unacceptable behaviour was so thin, so constantly shifting, that even the most conventional people lived in fear of crossing it inadvertently. The medieval period also saw the development of increasingly sophisticated methods of detection and punishment. The Church developed detailed manuals for identifying sodomites, complete with physical signs, behavioral indicators, and interrogation techniques. They trained priests and inquisitors to recognize the subtle signs of sexual deviance, to extract confessions through psychological manipulation, to identify entire networks of offenders. These detection methods were often based on pseudoscience and superstition, but they were taken very seriously by the authorities. A man who walked with too much grace, who spoke with too much refinement, who showed too much interest in fashion or beauty, might be marked for investigation. A woman who lived alone, who showed no interest in marriage, who had too many close female friends, might be suspected of unnatural relationships. The interrogation techniques were designed to break down resistance, to force confessions even from innocent people. Suspects were isolated, deprived of sleep, subjected to psychological pressure, threatened with torture or death. They were told that confession would lead to mercy, that denial would only make their punishment worse. But confession rarely led to mercy. More often, it led to demands for more information, for the names of accomplices, for details about a wider network of offenders. The authorities were convinced that homosexuality was a kind of conspiracy, a secret organization working to corrupt society from within. This belief in a gay conspiracy led to what we might call moral panics that swept through medieval communities. A single accusation might lead to dozens of arrests as authorities tried to uncover what they believed was a vast network of corruption. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Friends betrayed friends. Families disowned their own members. These moral panics were often triggered by external pressures. Economic difficulties, political instability, military defeats, natural disasters, all of these could lead to searches for scapegoats. Gay people, already marginalized and vulnerable, were convenient targets for communities looking for someone to blame for their troubles. The medieval period also saw the development of what we might call therapeutic approaches to homosexuality. These weren't medical treatments in the modern sense, but they were systematic attempts to change people's sexual desires through various forms of intervention. Some of these approaches were religious, involving intensive prayer, fasting, and spiritual discipline. Others were more physical, involving bloodletting, purging, or other medical procedures designed to rebalance the body's humours. Still others were psychological, involving isolation, sensory deprivation, or other forms of mental conditioning. None of these approaches were effective, but they were often fatal. People died from the medical procedures, from the psychological stress, from the physical abuse that accompanied these treatments. But the deaths were seen as unfortunate side effects rather than evidence that the approaches were flawed. The persistence of these therapeutic approaches reveals something important about medieval attitudes toward homosexuality. Despite the harsh punishments, despite the religious condemnation, there was still a belief that gay people could be cured if the right methods were applied. This created a kind of cruel hope, a suggestion that suffering could lead to redemption. But perhaps most tragically, these therapeutic approaches were often requested by gay people themselves. The internalized shame and self-hatred created by medieval society was so intense that many people genuinely wanted to be changed, to be freed from desires they had been taught to see as evil and corrupt. The medieval period also saw the development of what we might call gay martyrdom. Some people, faced with the choice between renouncing their love and facing death, chose death. They became, in effect, martyrs for the right to love authentically, though they were never recognized as such by the church or society. These martyrs weren't seeking death for its own sake. They were making a profound statement about the value of authentic love, about the importance of being true to one's deepest self, about the fundamental human right to love and be loved. Their deaths were acts of resistance, declarations that some things are worth dying for. But their sacrifices were largely forgotten, their stories suppressed, their courage unrecognized. They died as criminals and heretics, not as heroes. Their names were erased from records, their memories condemned to oblivion. They became the unknown soldiers in a war that most people didn't even know was being fought. The medieval period was also a time of what we might call gay exile. People who were discovered or suspected often had to flee their homes, their communities, their countries. They became wanderers, constantly moving to stay ahead of accusations, never able to settle down or build lasting relationships. These exiles created their own informal networks, their own underground communities. They developed codes and signals that allowed them to recognize each other, to find safe passage, to locate temporary refuge. They created a kind of invisible nation, a community without borders or territory, united only by shared experience of persecution. But exile was also a form of death. Cut off from family, friends, and familiar surroundings, many people simply disappeared. They died alone in foreign cities, their bodies unclaimed, their stories untold. They became ghosts, present but invisible, existing but not acknowledged. The medieval period also saw the development of what we might call gay resistance literature. These were coded texts, disguised as religious or philosophical works, that actually contain messages of support and solidarity for gay people. They used allegory, metaphor, and symbolism to communicate ideas that couldn't be expressed directly. These texts were dangerous to write and dangerous to read. Authors who were too obvious in their coding risked persecution. Readers who were caught with such texts could be accused of sharing the author's corruption. But the texts circulated anyway, passed from hand to hand, copied in secret, preserved despite the risks. The very existence of these texts proves that medieval gay people weren't just victims. They were also creators, thinkers, writers, artists. They found ways to express their experiences, to document their lives, to communicate with others like themselves. They created culture even in the face of cultural annihilation. But perhaps most importantly, these texts preserved hope. They reminded their readers that they weren't alone, that others had faced similar struggles, that love and authenticity were worth fighting for. They kept alive the dream that someday, somehow, things might be different. The medieval period was ending, but its legacy would persist for centuries. The legal frameworks developed during this time would continue to be used to persecute gay people well into the modern era. The religious teachings would continue to shape attitudes toward sexuality and gender. The methods of detection and punishment would continue to be refined and applied. But something else was also ending. The complete isolation of medieval gay people was beginning to break down. The networks they had created, the codes they had developed, the traditions they had preserved, all of these were creating the foundation for something new. The Renaissance was coming, bringing with it new ideas about human nature, new forms of artistic expression, new ways of thinking about love and desire. It wouldn't immediately create tolerance or acceptance, but it would create space for different kinds of human experience. The medieval night was long and dark, but it wasn't eternal. Dawn was coming, slowly, fitfully, with many setbacks and reversals, but it was coming nonetheless, carried forward by the courage of people who refused to be erased, who insisted on their right to love and be loved, who preserved hope even in the face of hopelessness. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember these hidden heroes. Remember their courage, their creativity, their refusal to surrender. They lived in darkness so that someday, somehow, we might live in light. They loved in secret so that love itself might survive. They preserved hope so that future generations might know freedom. Their stories remind us that human connection is stronger than human hatred, that love finds a way even in the darkest times, that the human spirit cannot be broken by laws or flames or fear. They are the ancestors of everyone who has ever had to hide their true self, the spiritual parents of everyone who has ever had to choose between authenticity and safety. The medieval world wanted them dead, but they chose to live. It wanted them silent, but they found ways to speak. It wanted them alone, but they found each other. Their legacy is not just survival, but the preservation of hope itself. Close your eyes now. Let their courage carry you into dreams where love is not a crime, where identity is not a death sentence, where being different is not being dangerous. The medieval night is ending, and in its place, slowly, gently, the dawn of acceptance is beginning to break. But as the medieval period reached its twilight, something remarkable began to happen in the shadows. The very persecution that was meant to destroy gay people had, paradoxically, begun to create them as a distinct group. The shared experience of hiding, of coding, of surviving, had started to forge something that hadn't existed before, a collective identity born from collective suffering. This wasn't a movement in any modern sense. There were no organizations, no manifestos, no public demonstrations. But there was something else, something quieter, but no less profound. There was recognition, a glance across a crowded marketplace that said, "I know what you are because I am the same." A phrase dropped into conversation that carried double meaning. A kindness extended to a stranger who seemed to need protection. These moments of recognition were dangerous. To acknowledge someone else's difference was to risk exposing your own. But they happened anyway, because the human need for connection is stronger than the fear of death. People found ways to say, "You are not alone," without saying it directly. They created a language of survival that could be spoken without words. The records from the late medieval Venice tell us about the Glass Blowers Guild, which wasn't really about glass blowing at all. It was a network of men who provided protection and support for each other, who shared information about safe houses and dangerous accusations, who helped members flee when discovery seemed imminent. They used the language of craft and commerce to disguise what was really a mutual aid society for people who had no other protection. Similar networks existed across Europe, hidden within legitimate organizations or operating entirely underground. There were the traveling scholars who carried more than books between universities. The pilgrims who found spiritual comfort in each other rather than in holy sites. The merchant associations that traded in discretion and silence rather than goods. These networks were fragile, constantly threatened by betrayal or discovery. But they were also remarkably resilient. When one was destroyed, another would emerge to take its place. When members were arrested or killed, others would step forward to continue the work. The underground community had learned to survive by dispersing, by adapting, by never depending too heavily on any single person or place. The women had their own networks, though they were necessarily different from the men's. The healing circles that gathered around wise women and herbalists provided cover for relationships that might otherwise have attracted suspicion. The religious sisters who lived together in informal communities, caring for the sick and the poor, created spaces where women could love each other under the guise of Christian charity. These female networks were often more stable than the male ones, partly because medieval society was less suspicious of women's relationships with each other. But they were also more isolated, less connected to the broader underground community. Women's networks rarely intersected with men's, creating parallel but separate worlds of hidden identity. The late medieval period also saw the emergence of what we might call gay literature in the truest sense. These weren't just coded messages or hidden meanings, but works that were consciously created by and for people who shared the experience of same-sex love. They were written in secret, circulated carefully, preserved at great risk. The poetry of this period is particularly revealing. Poets found ways to write about love that couldn't be named directly, using elaborate metaphors and classical allusions to express feelings that had no acceptable vocabulary. They wrote about the beauty of young men in terms borrowed from religious devotion. They described the pain of separation in language that echoed the mystic's longing for God. But if you knew how to read between the lines, if you understood the codes and references, these poems revealed a rich emotional landscape that the official culture denied existed. They spoke of passion and longing, of secret meetings and stolen kisses, of the agony of hiding and the ecstasy of brief connection. They created a literature of the closet that was no less powerful for being invisible. The visual arts of the period also began to reflect this hidden culture. Painters found ways to include same-sex couples in religious scenes, disguising them as saints or angels. Sculptors created figures that seemed to gaze at each other with more than brotherly affection. Illuminated manuscripts contained tiny details that spoke to those who knew how to look. These artistic expressions were dangerous to create and dangerous to commission. Artists who were too obvious in their coding risked persecution. Patrons who supported such work could be accused of sharing the artist's corruption. But the art was created anyway, because the need for representation, for visibility, for cultural expression was stronger than the fear of consequences. The late medieval period also saw the development of more sophisticated survival strategies. People learned to create multiple identities, to maintain different personas in different contexts. A man might be a devoted family man in his home village, a passionate lover in a distant city, and a pious monk when travelling between the two. The compartmentalization was exhausting but necessary. Women developed their own strategies, often involving the creation of elaborate cover stories. Two women might claim to be sisters or cousins, or the widow and companion of a deceased man. They would maintain separate bedrooms for appearances while sharing a life in private. They would speak of their relationship in terms of Christian duty or family obligation, never acknowledging the deeper bonds that truly held them together. These survival strategies required constant vigilance, constant performance, constant fear. People had to remember which identity they were supposed to be projecting in which context. They had to maintain friendships and relationships that were purely for show, while hiding the connections that truly mattered to them. They lived multiple lives simultaneously, and the exhaustion was immense. But perhaps most remarkably, some people began to push back against the system more directly. These weren't organized resistance movements, but individual acts of defiance that slowly began to chip away at the foundations of persecution. A scholar who wrote too openly about forbidden love. A merchant who refused to hide his relationship despite social pressure. A woman who lived as a man, not just for survival, but as a statement of identity. These acts of resistance were often fatal. The people who engaged in them usually paid with their lives. But they also created cracks in the system, moments when the official narrative was challenged, when the possibility of a different way of being was made visible, even if only briefly. The case of Eleanor Rykener is particularly fascinating. In 1394, Eleanor was arrested in London and charged with prostitution. But Eleanor had been born John and had been living as a woman for several years. The court records reveal a complex story of gender identity, sexuality, and survival in medieval London. Eleanor worked as both a male and female prostitute, moved between different identities with apparent ease, and seemed to have found a community of people who accepted both personas. Eleanor's case is remarkable, not just for its early date, but for the matter-of-fact way it was recorded. The court clerks seem almost bored by the details, as if cases like this were more common than the official records suggest. Eleanor wasn't burned or tortured, just fined and released. The casual nature of the punishment suggests that the authorities were more concerned with maintaining public order than with enforcing rigid gender norms. But Eleanor's story also reveals the precariousness of medieval gender performance. Living as the opposite gender required constant vigilance, constant performance, constant risk. Discovery could mean not just legal punishment, but social ostracism, economic ruin, and physical violence. Yet people like Eleanor persisted, creating lives that were authentic even when they were dangerous. The late medieval period also saw the emergence of what we might call gay pilgrimage. People began to travel not just for religious reasons, but to find communities where they could be more open about their identities. Certain cities developed reputations as places where different kinds of people could find refuge. Venice, Florence, Paris, London all became destinations for people seeking freedom from the constraints of their home communities. This pilgrimage was risky. Travel was dangerous in medieval times, and people who were already marginalized were particularly vulnerable. But the networks that had developed provided some protection. Travelers could find safe houses, friendly contacts, temporary refuge. The underground community had learned to extend its protection beyond local boundaries. The irony is that many of these pilgrims were genuinely religious. They weren't rejecting Christianity, but seeking a version of it that could accommodate their authentic selves. They prayed in the same churches that condemned them, sought blessing from the same God whose representatives wanted them dead. They found ways to maintain their faith while rejecting the hatred that was preached in its name. Some found refuge in mystical traditions that emphasize personal relationship with God over institutional authority. Others were drawn to heretical movements that challenged church doctrine. Still others remained orthodox in their beliefs while finding ways to reinterpret teachings about sexuality and gender. The diversity of religious expression among medieval gay people was remarkable. But perhaps most importantly, the late medieval period saw the beginning of what we might call gay history. People began to preserve stories, to maintain records, to create archives of their experiences. They understood that their lives had value, that their stories mattered, that future generations needed to know what they had endured. This historical consciousness was dangerous. Keeping records meant creating evidence that could be used against them. Writing down names and places meant risking the exposure of entire networks. But they did it anyway, because they understood that without history, there could be no future. The chronicles they kept were often coded, disguised as religious texts or business records. The letters they preserved were written in careful language that could be interpreted multiple ways. The poems they collected were attributed to fictional authors or left anonymous. But the records survived, hidden in monastery libraries, sealed in merchant strongboxes, passed down through generations of trusted keepers. These archives reveal the richness of medieval gay culture. They show us people who weren't just victims, but creators, thinkers, lovers, dreamers. They document relationships that lasted decades, friendships that spanned continents, communities that provided meaning and support in the face of overwhelming hostility. The late medieval period also saw the development of more sophisticated theological arguments in favor of same-sex love. These weren't published openly, of course, but they circulated in manuscript form among educated gay people. They drew on classical philosophy, biblical scholarship, and natural law theory to argue that love between people of the same gender could be holy, natural, and blessed by God. These theological arguments were carefully crafted, using the same intellectual tools that the church used to condemn homosexuality. They quoted scripture, cited church fathers, and employed scholastic reasoning to reach very different conclusions. They argued that the Bible condemned only certain specific acts in certain specific contexts, not love between people of the same gender in general. But more importantly, these theological arguments provided intellectual framework for people who were struggling to reconcile their faith with their identity. They offered a way to remain Christian while rejecting the hatred that was preached in Christianity's name. They suggested that God's love was broader than the church's narrow interpretation allowed. The impact of these theological arguments was profound, even though they were never officially recognized. They allowed people to maintain their spiritual lives while living authentically. They provided language for understanding same-sex love as sacred rather than sinful. They created space for gay people within Christian tradition, even if that space remained hidden and unofficial. As the medieval period drew to its close, as the Renaissance began to dawn, the situation for gay people remained dangerous but had subtly changed. The networks were stronger, the culture was richer, the sense of identity was more developed. People had learned not just to survive, but to thrive, to create meaning and beauty even in the face of persecution. The underground community had become something more than just a survival mechanism. It had become a culture with its own traditions, its own values, its own forms of artistic expression. It had developed its own understanding of love, relationships, and identity that was independent of official church teaching. But perhaps most importantly, it had developed hope. The people who lived in medieval shadows had begun to imagine a different future. They didn't expect to see tolerance or acceptance in their lifetimes, but they began to believe that such things might be possible someday. They planted seeds that would take centuries to grow, but they planted them nonetheless. The medieval world was ending, but its legacy would persist in complex ways. The legal frameworks would continue to oppress gay people for centuries to come. The religious teachings would continue to shape attitudes towards sexuality and gender. The methods of persecution would continue to be refined and applied. But something else was also ending. The complete isolation of gay people was breaking down. The networks they had created, the culture they had developed, the hope they had preserved, all of these were creating the foundation for something new. The Renaissance wouldn't immediately bring tolerance, but it would bring new possibilities for human expression and identity. The medieval night was long and dark, but it wasn't eternal. Dawn was coming, slowly, fitfully, with many setbacks and reversals. But it was coming nonetheless, carried forward by the courage of people who refused to be erased, who insisted on their right to love and be loved, who preserved hope even in the face of hopelessness. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, as you let the weight of these stories settle around you like a blanket, remember that the medieval period was not just a time of darkness and persecution. It was also a time of remarkable courage and creativity, of people who refused to be erased, who found ways to love and be loved despite impossible odds. These medieval souls, these hidden lovers, these secret communities, they are the ancestors of everyone who has ever had to hide their true self. They are the spiritual parents of everyone who has ever had to choose between authenticity and safety. They are the foundation upon which our modern freedoms are built. Their stories remind us that human connection is stronger than human hatred, that love finds a way even in the darkest times, that the human spirit cannot be broken by laws or flames or fear. They lived in shadows so that someday, somehow, we might live in light. They loved in secret so that love itself might survive. The medieval night is ending, but slowly, gently, like dawn breaking over a long, dark landscape. And in that dawn, there is room for everyone. Close your eyes now. Let their courage carry you into dreams where love is not a crime, where identity is not a death sentence, where being different is not being dangerous. The shadows are lifting, the light is coming, and in that light, finally, there is space for every kind of love, every form of identity, every way of being human. Rest now in that promise, in that hope, in that slow but certain dawn. As the medieval period finally began to release its grip on Europe, as the first tentative lights of the Renaissance started to flicker in Italian cities and northern courts, the situation for gay people remained precarious but had undergone subtle, crucial changes. The networks that had been forged in secrecy had grown stronger, more sophisticated, more resilient. What had begun as desperate survival mechanisms had evolved into something approaching culture. The merchant cities of northern Italy were particularly important in this transformation. Venice, Florence, Milan, these bustling centers of trade and finance attracted people from across Europe, creating cosmopolitan environments where difference was more likely to be tolerated or at least overlooked. A young man fleeing accusations in Germany might find refuge in a Venetian trading house. Two women from France might establish themselves as silk merchants in Florence, their business partnership providing perfect cover for their personal relationship. These cities offered something that had been almost impossible to find in medieval Europe: anonymity. In a small village, everyone knew everyone else's business. But in a city of 50,000 people, it was possible to disappear, to reinvent yourself, to live according to different rules. The urban environment created spaces where the rigid social hierarchies of feudal society began to break down. The rise of humanism during the early Renaissance also had profound, if indirect, effects on attitudes towards sexuality and gender. Humanist scholars rediscovered classical texts that had been suppressed or ignored during the medieval period. They read Plato's Symposium, with its celebration of love between men. They studied Roman poets who wrote openly about same-sex desire. They encountered philosophical traditions that saw human love, in all its forms, as a reflection of divine beauty. This classical revival didn't immediately lead to tolerance, but it did create intellectual space for different ways of thinking about love and desire. Humanist scholars began to argue that human nature was more complex, more varied than medieval theology had allowed. They suggested that the rigid categories of medieval thought might not capture the full range of human experience. Some of these scholars were themselves gay, and they used their positions to subtly advocate for broader understanding of human sexuality. They wrote commentaries on classical texts that emphasized the spiritual dimension of same-sex love. They created new translations that softened the condemnatory language of earlier versions. They argued that ancient wisdom should be taken seriously, even when it challenged contemporary assumptions. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century had complex effects on gay culture. On one hand, it allowed anti-gay propaganda to spread more widely than ever before. Treatises condemning sodomy could be printed in multiple copies and distributed across Europe. Legal codes that criminalized same-sex activity could be standardized and enforced more systematically. But the printing press also created new opportunities for coded communication. Books could carry hidden messages, double meanings, subtle references that only certain readers would understand. Classical texts that had been suppressed during the medieval period could be reprinted and circulated. New works could be written that used allegory and metaphor to explore themes that couldn't be addressed directly. The early Renaissance also saw the development of what we might call gay tourism. Wealthy individuals began to travel not just for business or pilgrimage, but for pleasure, for education, for the experience of different cultures. Some of these travelers were seeking communities where they could be more open about their identities. Others were simply fleeing the constraints of their home environments. This tourism created new networks of connection that spanned Europe. A young English nobleman might study in Padua, where he would encounter ideas about love and beauty that were foreign to his Protestant upbringing. A French merchant might establish business contacts in Florence, where he would discover communities of men who shared his interests. A German scholar might travel to Rome, where he would find libraries containing books that had been banned in his homeland. These travelers carried more than just goods and ideas. They carried stories, contacts, letters of introduction. They created informal networks that connected gay communities across national boundaries. They established safe houses, friendly contacts, places where travelers could find temporary refuge and understanding. The Renaissance court culture also created new opportunities for same-sex relationships. These courts were theatrical environments where appearance, wit, and charm were highly valued. Young men who might have been suspect in other contexts could find acceptance as courtiers, as artists, as entertainers. The emphasis on beauty and refinement created space for sensibilities that would have been condemned in more traditional settings. But court culture was also dangerous. The same theatrical environment that protected some people also exposed them to constant scrutiny. Court politics were vicious, and sexual scandal was a powerful weapon. A courtier who fell from favor might find his private life exposed and used against him. The protection that court culture offered was always conditional, always revocable. The Renaissance also saw the emergence of what we might call gay artistic communities. Artists, writers, musicians, and scholars began to cluster together in informal networks that provided both professional support and personal acceptance. These communities were often centered around wealthy patrons who were themselves gay, or at least tolerant of difference. The workshop system that dominated Renaissance art created opportunities for intense relationships between masters and apprentices. Young men would live and work together for years, sharing not just professional training, but intimate daily life. Some of these relationships were clearly romantic, though they were rarely acknowledged as such publicly. The artistic communities of Florence are particularly well documented. The city's workshops produced some of the greatest art in human history, but they also provided refuge for men who might have faced persecution elsewhere. The emphasis on beauty, on the human form, on emotional expression, created a culture where different kinds of love and desire could be explored, even if they couldn't be openly acknowledged. But perhaps most importantly, the Renaissance began to create new ways of thinking about identity itself. The medieval period had seen identity as fixed, determined by birth, unchangeable. But Renaissance humanists began to argue that human beings had the capacity for self-transformation, for growth, for change. They suggested that identity was not just given, but could be chosen, created, performed. This new understanding of identity had profound implications for gay people. It suggested that the categories that medieval society had used to define and constrain them were not natural or eternal, but human constructs that could be questioned and changed. It opened up possibilities for different ways of being human that had been unimaginable in earlier periods. The Renaissance also saw the development of more sophisticated understandings of gender. Artists studied human anatomy with unprecedented precision, but they also explored the boundaries between masculine and feminine beauty. They created images of androgynous figures that challenged traditional gender categories. They developed new ways of representing the human body that emphasized its fluidity rather than its fixity. These artistic explorations didn't immediately translate into social acceptance, but they did create cultural space for different ways of thinking about gender and sexuality. They suggested that the rigid categories of medieval thought might not capture the full complexity of human experience. The Protestant Reformation, which began in the early 16th century, had complex effects on gay culture. On one hand, Protestant reformers were often more rigid in their moral teachings than the Catholic Church had been. They emphasized personal responsibility, individual salvation, and strict adherence to biblical law. They were suspicious of the kind of flexibility that had sometimes protected gay people in Catholic contexts. But the Reformation also created new opportunities for dissent, for alternative interpretations of Christian teaching. If individual believers could read and interpret the Bible for themselves, then perhaps they could find different meanings in its teachings about sexuality and gender. If church authority could be questioned, then perhaps other forms of authority could be challenged as well. Some Protestant communities developed more tolerant attitudes toward difference, not because they approved of homosexuality, but because they were more focused on other issues. The emphasis on salvation by faith rather than works meant that personal morality was less central to salvation. The focus on individual relationship with God meant that church authorities had less power to regulate private behavior. The Renaissance also saw the development of what we might call gay science. Scholars began to study human sexuality with new rigor, new methods, new assumptions. They read medical texts from the classical period that offered different explanations for same-sex desire. They conducted anatomical studies that challenged medieval understandings of gender difference. They developed new theories about the relationship between body and mind, nature and culture. These scientific investigations didn't immediately lead to tolerance, but they did create intellectual frameworks that would eventually support more accepting attitudes. They suggested that human sexuality was more complex than medieval theology had recognized. They opened up possibilities for understanding same-sex desire as natural rather than sinful. The Renaissance was also a time of great geographical expansion. European explorers were encountering new worlds, new peoples, new ways of organizing society. Some of these encounters challenged European assumptions about sexuality and gender. Travelers reported societies where same-sex relationships were accepted, where gender roles were different, where the rigid categories of European thought didn't apply. These reports were often distorted, exaggerated, or misunderstood. But they did create awareness that European sexual norms were not universal, that other ways of organizing human relationships were possible. They planted seeds of doubt about the naturalness of European sexual morality. The Renaissance also saw the development of more sophisticated forms of resistance to persecution. Gay people learned to use the legal system to protect themselves, to exploit loopholes and ambiguities in the law. They developed networks of lawyers, judges, and officials who could be trusted to provide protection. They created elaborate systems of mutual support that could mobilize quickly when members were threatened. These resistance networks were often connected to broader political movements. Gay people allied themselves with religious dissidents, political reformers, and social critics who were also challenging established authority. They found common cause with others who were marginalized or oppressed by the existing system. The Renaissance also saw the emergence of what we might call gay literature in the modern sense. Writers began to create works that were consciously addressed to gay readers, that used coding and symbolism to explore themes of same-sex love and desire. These works were more sophisticated than their medieval predecessors, more psychologically complex, more emotionally nuanced. The poetry of Michelangelo is perhaps the most famous example. His sonnets to young men are clearly love poems, passionate and intimate, though they use the language of Platonic philosophy to disguise their true nature. They speak of spiritual love, of the beauty of the soul, of the divine nature of human affection. But to readers who understood the codes, they were unmistakably expressions of same-sex desire. Similar works appeared across Europe, written by authors who had learned to navigate the dangerous territory between expression and exposure. They created a body of literature that spoke to gay readers while remaining invisible to hostile audiences. They developed new forms of artistic expression that could carry hidden meanings while appearing conventional on the surface. The Renaissance also saw the development of more sophisticated forms of community organization. Gay people learned to create institutions that could provide support and protection while maintaining the appearance of respectability. They established guilds, religious confraternities, artistic societies, and scholarly associations that served as fronts for gay social networks. These organizations were often multifunctional, serving legitimate purposes while also providing space for gay people to meet, socialize, and support each other. They created structures that could survive persecution, that could adapt to changing circumstances, that could provide continuity across generations. The Renaissance also saw the beginning of what we might call gay internationalism. The networks that had developed within individual cities and regions began to connect with each other, creating continent-wide communities of support and solidarity. Letters were exchanged, visits were arranged, information was shared about safe places and dangerous ones. This internationalism was facilitated by the growing ease of travel, the expansion of trade networks, and the development of new forms of communication. But it was also driven by the recognition that gay people shared common interests and common vulnerabilities, regardless of nationality or social position. The Renaissance was also a time of great artistic achievement, and gay people played crucial roles in this cultural flowering. They were prominent as artists, writers, musicians, and patrons. They created works of lasting beauty and significance. They contributed to the development of new forms of artistic expression. But their contributions were rarely acknowledged openly. They worked under pseudonyms, created anonymous works, or had their achievements attributed to others. They were written out of history, their names erased from records, their roles minimized or ignored. The Renaissance also saw the development of more sophisticated forms of gender performance. People learned to manipulate clothing, gesture, speech, and behavior to create different impressions of their gender identity. They developed techniques for passing as the opposite gender, for moving between different gender presentations, for expressing gender in ways that challenged conventional categories. These performances were often necessary for survival, But they were also forms of artistic expression, ways of exploring the boundaries of identity and possibility. They created new ways of being human that went beyond the rigid categories of medieval thought. The Renaissance was also a time of great religious ferment, and gay people were often drawn to mystical and heterodox traditions that offered alternatives to mainstream Christianity. They found inspiration in texts that emphasized direct experience of the divine, that minimized the importance of institutional authority, that celebrated the spiritual dimension of human love. These religious explorations didn't always lead to tolerance, but they did create intellectual space for different ways of understanding sexuality and spirituality. They suggested that the harsh condemnations of mainstream Christianity might not represent the full truth about God's will. As the Renaissance reached its peak in the 16th century, the situation for gay people had changed dramatically from what it had been in the medieval period. The networks were stronger, the culture was richer, the sense of identity was more developed. People had learned not just to survive but to thrive, to create meaning and beauty even in the face of continued persecution. The underground community had become something more than just a survival mechanism. It had become a culture with its own traditions, its own values, its own forms of artistic expression. It had developed its own understanding of love, relationships, and identity that was independent of official religious teaching. But perhaps most importantly, it had developed hope. The people who lived in Renaissance shadows had begun to imagine a different future. They didn't expect to see full acceptance in their lifetimes, but they began to believe that such things might be possible someday. They planted seeds that would take centuries to grow, but they planted them nonetheless. The Renaissance world was still dangerous for gay people, but it was also full of new possibilities. The rigid categories of medieval thought were beginning to break down. New ways of understanding human nature were emerging. The foundations were being laid for even greater changes to come. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, as you let the weight of these Renaissance stories settle around you like a warm blanket, remember that change is possible, that progress is real, that the human spirit cannot be permanently suppressed. The people who lived in these earlier centuries faced challenges we can barely imagine, but they persevered, they created, they loved. They are the ancestors of everyone who has ever had to hide their true self, the spiritual parents of everyone who has ever had to choose between authenticity and safety. They are the foundation upon which our modern freedoms are built. Their stories remind us that human connection is stronger than human hatred, that love finds a way even in the darkest times, that hope can survive even the most determined efforts to destroy it. The Renaissance night is ending, but slowly, gently, like dawn breaking over a long, dark landscape. And in that dawn, there is room for everyone. Close your eyes now. Let their courage carry you into dreams, where love is celebrated, where identity is a gift, where being different is being beautiful. The shadows are lifting, the light is growing stronger, and in that light finally, there is space for every kind of love, every form of identity, every way of being human. Rest now in that promise, in that hope, in that slow but certain dawn. The Renaissance was fading now, giving way to new forms of thought, new structures of power, new methods of control. And for gay people, this transition brought both promise and peril in equal measure. The Enlightenment was dawning, with its emphasis on reason, natural law, and scientific inquiry. Surely, one might think, this age of logic would bring greater understanding, greater tolerance, greater acceptance of human diversity. But the Enlightenment was not the liberation it might have seemed. Instead, it brought new forms of persecution, more systematic, more scientific, more coldly rational than anything the medieval world had produced. The Age of Reason would prove to be in many ways the age of refined cruelty. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the development of what we might call scientific homophobia. Scholars began to study homosexuality not as a sin or a crime, but as a medical condition, a form of mental illness, a deviation from natural law. They developed elaborate theories about its causes, its symptoms, its potential cures. They created new vocabularies for describing same-sex desire, new categories for classifying sexual deviance. This medicalization of homosexuality was presented as progress, as a more enlightened approach than the religious condemnation of earlier periods. Instead of burning sodomites at the stake, the new thinking went, society should treat them, cure them, rehabilitate them. It was a gentler form of persecution, but persecution nonetheless. The medical theories of the period were often bizarre by modern standards. Some doctors claimed that homosexuality was caused by excessive masturbation, which weakened the sexual organs and confused their natural function. Others blamed it on tight clothing, which supposedly compressed the genitals and altered their development. Still others suggested that it was the result of improper diet, bad air, or the influence of the planets. These theories led to treatments that were often more horrific than the medieval punishments they replaced. Gay people were subjected to cold water baths, electrical shocks, surgical procedures, and powerful drugs designed to correct their sexual orientation. They were locked in asylums, subjected to isolation, forced to undergo procedures that were supposed to restore their natural desires. The case of Robert James, a young English gentleman who was committed to Bethlehem Hospital in 1743, illustrates the horror of these medical interventions. Robert had been discovered in a compromising position with another man and was diagnosed with sexual melancholy. He was subjected to bleeding, purging, cold baths, and enforced celibacy. He was kept in isolation for months, fed a restricted diet, and forced to perform manual labor designed to redirect his energies. Robert's treatment was considered enlightened for its time, a humane alternative to execution or imprisonment. But the records show that he emerged from the hospital broken, traumatized, and no less gay than when he entered. He simply learned to hide his desires more effectively, to perform heterosexuality more convincingly, to live a more thoroughly double life. The Enlightenment also saw the development of more sophisticated legal frameworks for persecuting gay people. The old religious laws were replaced by secular statutes that were presented as being based on natural law and scientific understanding. The punishment might be less severe than burning at the stake, but the legal apparatus was more efficient, more systematic, more difficult to evade. The famous case of the Molly Houses in early 18th century London shows how this new legal system worked. The Molly Houses were taverns and private clubs where gay men could meet, socialize, and sometimes engage in sexual activity. They were semi-secret institutions that provided community and refuge for men who had few other places to turn. But the authorities were watching. In 1726, they launched a coordinated raid on several Molly Houses, arresting dozens of men and gathering evidence about a network that had existed for years. The trials that followed were public spectacles with detailed testimony about the activities that took place in these establishments. The men who were caught in these raids faced a range of punishments. Some were pilloried, locked in public stocks, where crowds could throw refuse at them, spit on them, sometimes beat them to death. Others were imprisoned, transported to the colonies, or executed. The network was destroyed, but more importantly, the message was sent. There was no safe space, no refuge, no community that the authorities could not reach. The Enlightenment period also saw the development of what we might call gay panic as a legal defense. Men who killed other men could claim that they had been propositioned, that their masculine honor had been threatened, that they had acted in self-defense against an unnatural assault. This defense was often successful, creating a legal framework that essentially decriminalized violence against gay people. The case of Thomas Newton, who killed his roommate in Philadelphia in 1785, shows how this defense worked. Newton claimed that his roommate had made advances toward him, that he had been forced to defend his virtue, that his actions were justified by natural law and Christian morality. The jury acquitted him, and the case became a precedent for similar defenses in courts across America and Europe. But perhaps the most insidious development of the Enlightenment period was the way it created new forms of internalized oppression. The medical model of homosexuality taught gay people to view themselves as sick, abnormal, in need of cure. The scientific language gave a veneer of objectivity to what was essentially moral condemnation. Gay people internalized these messages, becoming their own worst enemies. The Diary of William Beckford, an English writer and politician of the late 18th century, reveals the psychological torment that this new understanding created. Beckford wrote about his attraction to men in terms of disease, corruption, and moral failure. He described his desires as the curse, the malady, the corruption of my nature. He spent his life trying to cure himself, to reform his desires, to become the man that society expected him to be. Beckford's wealth and social position protected him from the worst consequences of discovery, but they couldn't protect him from the psychological damage of living in a world that told him he was fundamentally flawed. He married, had children, tried to live a conventional life, but he never escaped the sense that he was broken, abnormal, deserving of punishment. The Enlightenment also saw the development of new forms of surveillance and control. The rise of modern police forces, the development of record-keeping systems, the creation of bureaucratic institutions, all of these made it easier for authorities to monitor and control gay people. The informal networks that had provided protection in earlier periods became more vulnerable to systematic investigation. The case of the Paris police archives from the 18th century shows how this surveillance system worked. The police kept detailed records of suspected homosexuals, their meeting places, their associates, their activities. They developed networks of informants who reported on gay gatherings, gay relationships, gay individuals. They created files that could be used to blackmail, prosecute, or simply harass people who were suspected of sexual deviance. These surveillance systems were presented as scientific, objective, necessary for maintaining public order. But they were also tools of oppression, ways of controlling and intimidating people who were already marginalized and vulnerable. They created a climate of fear that went beyond anything the medieval world had produced. The Enlightenment period also saw the development of new forms of gender policing. The rise of bourgeois society created more rigid expectations about masculine and feminine behavior. Men were expected to be rational, aggressive, focused on public achievement. Women were expected to be emotional, passive, focused on domestic concerns. Anyone who deviated from these norms faced suspicion and punishment. This gender policing affected gay people in complex ways. Effeminate men were automatically suspected of sexual deviance, while masculine women were seen as unnatural and threatening. But it also affected heterosexual people who didn't conform to rigid gender expectations. The Enlightenment created a world where everyone was expected to perform their gender role convincingly, where any deviation might be seen as evidence of sexual abnormality. The case of Charlotte Charke, an English actress who spent much of her life dressed as a man, shows how this gender policing worked. Charke performed on stage as both male and female characters, lived openly with female lovers, and challenged conventional expectations about women's roles. She was celebrated for her talent, but also condemned for her lifestyle, seen as both entertaining and threatening. Charke's autobiography, published in 1755, reveals the complex negotiations required to live as a gender non-conforming person in Enlightenment society. She had to constantly justify her choices, explain her behavior, defend her right to live authentically. She was successful in many ways, but she also paid a heavy price in terms of social acceptance and personal happiness. The Enlightenment also saw the development of new forms of resistance to persecution. Gay people learned to use the language of reason and natural law to defend themselves. They argued that their desires were natural, that persecution was irrational, that tolerance was more enlightened than condemnation. They created new forms of advocacy that would eventually evolve into modern gay rights movements. The writings of Jeremy Bentham, the English philosopher, show how this resistance worked. Bentham argued that homosexuality was a victimless crime, that laws against it were based on prejudice rather than reason, that a truly enlightened society would tolerate private sexual behavior between consenting adults. His arguments were too radical for his time, but they'd laid the groundwork for later advocacy. Bentham's manuscripts on homosexuality weren't published during his lifetime, but they circulated in limited circles, influencing other thinkers and activists. They showed that it was possible to use Enlightenment principles to defend gay people, that reason and logic could be turned against the very system that claimed to embody them. The Enlightenment period also saw the development of more sophisticated forms of community organization. Gay people learned to create institutions that could provide support and protection while appearing completely respectable. They established reading societies, dining clubs, charitable organizations, and cultural societies that served as fronts for gay social networks. These organizations were often more successful than their medieval predecessors because they used the language and forms of Enlightenment society. They presented themselves as rational, scientific, devoted to human improvement and social progress. They attracted members who were interested in intellectual discourse, cultural refinement, and social reform. The Society for the Improvement of Natural Knowledge, founded in London in 1748, was one such organization. Officially, it was devoted to scientific research and philosophical discussion. Unofficially, it provided a meeting place for gay men who shared interests in literature, art, and social reform. The Society published papers on natural history, sponsored lectures on scientific topics, and maintained a library of philosophical works. But the Society also provided something more important: community. Members could socialize freely, form friendships, discuss their interests without fear of condemnation. They could be themselves in ways that were impossible in the broader society. The Society created a space where gay men could exist as intellectuals, as citizens, as human beings worthy of respect. The Enlightenment also saw the development of what we might call gay literature in the modern sense. Writers began to create works that explicitly addressed gay themes, that used the language of sentiment and sensibility to explore same-sex love, that challenged conventional assumptions about sexuality and gender. The novel The Persian Letters by Montesquieu, published in 1721, contains one of the first positive portrayals of homosexuality in European literature. The book uses the device of letters from Persian travelers to critique European society, and one of the letters describes a culture where same-sex love is accepted and celebrated. The portrayal is brief and coded, but it represents a significant departure from the condemnatory literature of earlier periods. Similar works appeared across Europe, written by authors who had learned to navigate the dangerous territory between expression and exposure. They created a body of literature that spoke to gay readers while remaining invisible to hostile audiences. They developed new forms of artistic expression that could carry hidden meanings while appearing conventional on the surface. The Enlightenment period also saw the development of more sophisticated forms of international networking. The growth of postal systems, the expansion of trade networks, and the development of new forms of communication made it easier for gay people to maintain contacts across national boundaries. Letters were exchanged, visits were arranged, information was shared about safe places and dangerous ones. This international networking was facilitated by the cosmopolitan culture of the Enlightenment. Educated people travelled more freely than in previous periods. They read books from different countries. They corresponded with intellectuals across Europe. Gay people used these networks to create communities that transcended national boundaries. The correspondence of Horace Walpole, the English writer and politician, shows how these international networks functioned. Walpole maintained friendships with gay men across Europe, sharing information about books, art, politics, and personal matters. His letters reveal a community of like-minded individuals who supported each other despite being separated by geography and politics. The Enlightenment also saw the development of new forms of cultural expression that allowed gay people to explore their identities more openly. The cult of sensibility, with its emphasis on emotion and personal experience, created space for different kinds of love and desire. The Gothic novel, with its focus on the forbidden and the transgressive, provided a framework for exploring themes that couldn't be addressed directly. The works of Matthew Lewis, the English Gothic novelist, show how these new forms of expression worked. Lewis's novels are filled with characters who challenge conventional gender roles, who engage in forbidden relationships, who transgress social boundaries. The books were popular with both gay and straight readers, but they had special meaning for people who saw their own experiences reflected in the transgressive characters. The Enlightenment period also saw the development of more sophisticated forms of gender performance. People learned to manipulate clothing, gesture, speech, and behavior to create different impressions of their gender identity. They developed techniques for passing as the opposite gender, for moving between different gender presentations, for expressing gender in ways that challenged conventional categories. These performances were often necessary for survival, but they were also forms of artistic expression, ways of exploring the boundaries of identity and possibility. They created new ways of being human that went beyond the rigid categories of earlier periods. The case of the Chevalier d'Eon, a French diplomat who lived as both a man and a woman, shows how complex these gender performances could be. d'Eon served as a spy and diplomat while presenting as a man, then later lived openly as a woman in London. The transition was the subject of intense public speculation and debate, with people placing bets on d'Eon's true gender. d'Eon's story reveals the fluidity of gender identity in the Enlightenment period, but it also shows the limitations of that fluidity. d'Eon was able to live as both a man and a woman, but only by becoming a spectacle, a curiosity, an object of public fascination. The freedom to express gender differently came at the cost of being seen as abnormal, unusual, worthy of study rather than respect. The Enlightenment was ending now, giving way to new forms of thought, new structures of power, new methods of control. The 19th century would bring industrialization, urbanization, and new forms of both oppression and opportunity. The scientific revolution would continue, creating new ways of understanding human sexuality that would be both more sophisticated and more oppressive than anything that had come before. But the Enlightenment had also created something new: the possibility of using reason to challenge authority, of appealing to natural law to defend human rights, of creating secular arguments for tolerance and acceptance. The tools that had been used to persecute gay people could also be used to defend them. The same scientific method that had pathologized homosexuality could eventually be used to understand it. The networks that had been created during this period would survive and grow. The literature that had been written would be preserved and expanded. The arguments that had been developed would be refined and strengthened. The hope that had been kindled would continue to burn, even in the face of new forms of persecution. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, as you let the weight of these Enlightenment stories settle around you like a soft blanket, remember that progress is not always linear, that each generation must fight its own battles, that the tools of oppression can become the tools of liberation. The people who lived in these centuries faced challenges we can barely imagine, but they persevered, they created, they loved. They are the ancestors of everyone who has ever had to hide their true self, the spiritual parents of everyone who has ever had to choose between authenticity and safety. They are the foundation upon which our modern freedoms are built. Their stories remind us that human connection is stronger than human hatred, that love finds a way even in the darkest times, that hope can survive even the most determined efforts to destroy it. They lived in shadows so that someday, somehow, we might live in light. They loved in secret so that love itself might survive. The Enlightenment night is ending, but slowly, gently, like dawn breaking over a long dark landscape. And in that dawn, there is room for everyone. Close your eyes now. Let their courage carry you into dreams where love is celebrated, where identity is a gift, where being different is being beautiful. The shadows are lifting, the light is growing stronger, and in that light, finally, there is space for every kind of love, every form of identity, every way of being human. Rest now in that promise, in that hope, in that slow but certain dawn. The 19th century was dawning now, bringing with it the thunder of factory machines, the smoke of industrial cities, and new forms of both promise and peril for those who loved differently. The world was changing at a pace that would have seemed impossible to medieval minds, yet for gay people, this transformation was a double-edged sword that cut both ways. The rise of industrial cities created something unprecedented: anonymity on a massive scale. A young man fleeing whispers in a rural village could disappear into the teeming streets of Manchester or Birmingham, where no one knew his name, his family, his past. Two women could establish themselves as seamstresses or shopkeepers in London's sprawling neighbourhoods, their domestic arrangement just one of thousands that went unnoticed in the urban crowd. But cities also brought new forms of surveillance. The police forces that emerged to control these growing populations were more organised, more systematic, more efficient than anything that had come before. They developed new methods of tracking, new ways of gathering information, new techniques for identifying and prosecuting those who stepped outside the bounds of acceptable behaviour. The Victorian era, with its obsession with moral purity and social order, created a climate of sexual repression that affected everyone, but fell particularly hard on those whose desires didn't conform to the narrow expectations of respectable society. The very prosperity that allowed for greater privacy also created greater anxiety about what might be happening behind closed doors. Medical science was advancing rapidly, but this progress brought new forms of pathologizing that were more sophisticated and more damaging than anything the medieval world had produced. Doctors developed elaborate theories about sexual deviance, creating categories and classifications that turned love into illness, desire into disease. They spoke of sexual inversion, of contrary sexual feeling, of degeneracy that could be measured, diagnosed, and potentially cured. The case of Richard von Krafft-Ebing, whose Psychopathia Sexualis became the definitive medical text on sexuality, shows how this scientific approach worked. Published in 1886, the book contained detailed case studies of what the author called sexual aberrations, including hundreds of accounts of same-sex desire. The work was presented as objective science, but it was deeply moralistic, pathologizing behaviors that had once been seen as sinful and now were seen as sick. Yet even in this climate of medical condemnation, something remarkable was happening. For the first time in history, people were beginning to speak openly about their experiences, to challenge the assumptions that had governed their lives for centuries. The very act of creating categories for different types of sexuality inadvertently created communities of people who recognized themselves in these descriptions. The correspondence that survives from this period reveals a growing sense of identity, of shared experience, of collective understanding. People began to see themselves not as isolated individuals struggling with personal demons, but as members of a group that had always existed but had never been named. They began to write about their experiences, to defend their rights, to argue for understanding and acceptance. The writings of Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, a German lawyer who coined the term Urning to describe men who loved men, show how this new consciousness was developing. Ulrichs argued that same-sex attraction was a natural variation, not a disease or a crime. He wrote pamphlets defending the rights of what he called sexual minorities, using legal and scientific arguments to challenge the persecution they faced. Ulrichs's work was groundbreaking, not just for its content, but for its very existence. He was one of the first people to speak publicly about homosexuality from a position of knowledge and experience rather than condemnation. His writings were banned in many places, but they circulated underground, reaching people who had never before encountered positive representations of their own experiences. The late 19th century also saw the emergence of what we might recognize as the first gay rights organizations. These were small, secret groups that met in private homes or rented rooms, but they represented something new, the idea that gay people could organize collectively to defend their interests and challenge their oppression. The Scientific Humanitarian Committee, founded in Berlin in 1897, was perhaps the most significant of these early organizations. Led by Magnus Hirschfeld, a physician and sexologist, the committee worked to reform laws against homosexuality, to educate the public about sexual diversity, and to provide support for people who were struggling with their identity or facing persecution. Hirschfeld's work was remarkable for its time. He conducted surveys of sexual behavior, published scholarly articles about homosexuality, and argued that sexual orientation was a natural characteristic that should be protected by law. His Institute for Sexual Science, established in Berlin in 1919, became a center for research and activism that attracted people from across Europe and America. But the committee also faced enormous challenges. Its members had to work in secret, using pseudonyms and coded language to protect themselves from prosecution. They were constantly under surveillance by police and government authorities. Their meetings were raided, their publications banned, their leaders imprisoned or forced into exile. The rise of photography and mass media in the 19th century created new opportunities for gay people to find each other and build communities. Personal advertisements in newspapers, though carefully coded, allowed people to make contact across distances. Photographs could be exchanged, creating visual connections that transcended geographical boundaries. The development of department stores, restaurants, theatres, and other public spaces in major cities created new venues for socializing and meeting. Gay people learned to recognize each other through subtle signals, shared interests, and common gathering places. They developed what we might call gay geography within cities, knowing which parks, which cafes, which streets were safe for brief encounters or longer conversations. But these same technologies also created new vulnerabilities. Police learned to read the coded advertisements, to watch the popular meeting places, to use photography and other evidence-gathering techniques to build cases against suspected homosexuals. The very tools that enabled community also enabled persecution. The 19th century also saw the development of what we might call gay literature in the modern sense. Writers began to create works that explicitly addressed gay themes, that used the language of romanticism and realism to explore same-sex love, that challenged conventional assumptions about sexuality and gender. The poetry of Walt Whitman, with its celebration of male companionship and physical affection, created a new language for same-sex love. Whitman's Leaves of Grass was controversial in its time, but it also inspired countless readers who saw their own experiences reflected in his verses about the love of comrades and the beauty of the male body. Similar works appeared across Europe and America, written by authors who had learned to navigate the dangerous territory between expression and exposure. They created a body of literature that spoke to gay readers while remaining ambiguous enough to avoid prosecution. They developed new forms of artistic expression that could carry hidden meanings while appearing conventional on the surface. The 19th century was also a time of great social reform movements, and gay people were often drawn to causes that challenged conventional authority and championed individual rights. They participated in movements for women's suffrage, labour rights, and social reform, finding common cause with others who were marginalized or oppressed by the existing system. But their participation in these movements was always complicated by their own vulnerability. They had to be careful not to draw attention to themselves, not to become too visible or too prominent. They could support other people's rights while being unable to openly advocate for their own. The women's rights movement was particularly significant for lesbians, who found in feminist arguments about women's independence and autonomy a framework for defending their own choices. The new woman of the late 19th century, with her emphasis on education, career, and independence from male authority, created space for women who wanted to live with other women, even if they couldn't openly acknowledge the romantic nature of their relationships. The rise of women's colleges, professional organizations, and social reform movements created new opportunities for women to form intense relationships with each other. These Boston marriages were often accepted by society as practical arrangements between unmarried women, but they frequently involved deep emotional and sometimes physical intimacy. The correspondence between women in this period reveals relationships that were passionate, committed, and lasting. They wrote to each other in language that was openly romantic, expressing love and devotion that would have been scandalous if directed toward men. But because these relationships were seen as naturally feminine, they were often tolerated or even celebrated. The 19th century also saw the development of more sophisticated forms of gender performance and gender transgression. The rise of theatre, music halls, and other forms of popular entertainment created spaces where gender could be performed, parodied, and challenged. Female impersonators and male impersonators became popular entertainers, creating art forms that played with gender expectations and boundaries. But these performances were always ambiguous, always walking a fine line between entertainment and transgression. Performers had to be careful not to go too far, not to challenge gender norms too directly. They could play with gender as long as it was clearly understood to be play, not a serious challenge to social order. The case of Murray Hall, who lived as a man in New York for over 30 years, shows how complex these gender performances could be. Hall worked as a bail bondsman and politician, was married twice to women, and was only revealed to have been born female after death in 1901. Hall's story suggests that it was possible, with careful planning and good fortune, to live authentically as the opposite gender. But it also shows the constant vigilance and risk that such a life required. The 19th century was ending now, giving way to new forms of thought, new structures of power, new methods of both oppression and resistance. The 20th century would bring 2 world wars, social revolutions, and unprecedented changes in how people understood sexuality and gender. It would see the rise of fascism, which would target gay people for systematic persecution, but also the development of modern psychology, which would eventually challenge the pathological understanding of homosexuality. The networks that had been created during the 19th century would survive and grow, becoming the foundation for the gay rights movements of the 20th century. The literature that had been written would be preserved and expanded. The arguments that had been developed would be refined and strengthened. The hope that had been kindled would continue to burn, even in the face of new forms of persecution. But perhaps most importantly, the 19th century had created something that had never existed before, a sense of collective identity among gay people. They had begun to see themselves not as isolated individuals struggling with personal problems, but as members of a community that had always existed but had never been recognized. They had begun to develop their own culture, their own institutions, their own forms of resistance. The medieval world had tried to erase gay people entirely, to deny their very existence. The Renaissance had created some space for coded expression and hidden communities. The Enlightenment had pathologized same-sex desire, but had also created tools for challenging authority. The 19th century had brought both new forms of persecution and new forms of resistance. Now, As we reach the end of our journey through these dark centuries, we can see the slow but steady progress that was being made. Each generation built on the work of those who came before, creating networks, preserving stories, developing arguments, maintaining hope. The progress was painfully slow, often interrupted by setbacks and persecution, but it was real nonetheless. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, as you let the weight of these stories settle around you like a gentle blanket, remember that the world we live in today, with all its freedoms and possibilities, was built on the courage of people who lived in much darker times. They faced challenges we can barely imagine, but they persevered, they created, they loved. They are the ancestors of everyone who has ever had to hide their true self. The spiritual parents of everyone who has ever had to choose between authenticity and safety. They are the foundation upon which our modern freedoms are built. Their stories remind us that human connection is stronger than human hatred, that love finds a way even in the darkest times, that hope can survive even the most determined efforts to destroy it. The long night is ending. The shadows are lifting. The light is growing stronger. And in that light, finally, there is space for every kind of love, every form of identity, every way of being human. Rest now in that promise, in that hope, in that slow but certain dawn that they helped to create. Close your eyes. Let their courage carry you into dreams where love is celebrated, where identity is a gift, where being different is being beautiful. The medieval world is gone. The Renaissance shadows have faded. The Enlightenment's cold reason has warmed into something more human. The 19th century's medical pathologies are giving way to understanding, acceptance, and hope. The dawn is breaking, and in that dawn, there is room for everyone.